Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What is credential evaluation? I think we all sort of have in the back of our minds what we think it is. I personally didn't know this existed until I got a job in the field. I'd gone to university, I'd studied French and Arabic, went into the Peace Corps where I worked in Togo in West Africa, and eventually came and taught in Japan, and then came back to the States and was looking for a job, and found out an opening having to do with credential evaluation. So it is based on the principles of comparative education, which, as you all know, is an academic field, the conversion of educational credentials from one system to another. So why are they important? Why does it matter? So they provide a means for appropriate admissions, licensing decisions, etc. They help protect the public. They ensure fairness, and they help mitigate risk for institutions in the U.S. Anyway. If you admit people with falsified credentials or inaccurate evaluations, you have a chance of losing your accreditation. And they support learner mobility. So we want to be gatekeepers, right? But we also want to provide opportunities. And so as my boss, the founder of our organization, my old boss, would say, taxi drivers and doctors. So you don't want someone who was a taxi driver in his country to go to another country and to suddenly say, hey, I'm a doctor, like we saw earlier. Nor do you want someone who was a doctor in his or her country to come to another country and have to be a taxi driver. You want to fairly recognize educational achievements. History of international credential evaluation, I won't go on to it too much, but it's very interesting from a U.S. perspective because, as is typical in the U.S., anything that's it can be privatized, gets privatized, right? So years and years ago, credential evaluation was a governmental responsibility. And in the about late 70s, early 80s, credential evaluation agencies became privatized. So there are a number that are they're all non-governmental, some are non-profit, others are for-profit, but there are a whole slew of them. And we do things in very different ways, very different. Like, for example, you might have a 3-year European Bologna bachelor's degree, and 2 different evaluation agencies in the States will evaluate those differently, treat credits differently, and so on. Obviously, in Europe and in most of the rest of the world, credential evaluation is still a governmental responsibility. In Europe, it tends to be ENIC-NARIC offices that do a lot of evaluations. Some universities do them themselves. Also in the States, some universities do their own evaluations. Our field is changing a bit. There are a number of recognition conventions now that have been ratified. The Global Recognition Convention is the biggest one, and it really does change how we do our jobs. Now, granted, not all countries are signatories, but in essence, some of them are saying, listen, if somebody is a teacher in their country and they want to be a teacher in your country, you should start from the perspective that they're a teacher. So not starting from the gatekeeper, we want to keep them out because they don't learn to be a teacher the same way we do here, but you want to start from the perspective of, I think we can find a way to recognize this credential, and they can come here and be a teacher. Okay, so typically credential evaluations are advisory. We do at my office, when I started about 30 years ago, I would say about 80 to 90% of our evaluations were for further education purposes. People would come to the States to go to postgraduate study, to earn a degree, Most of them, we would even evaluate high school or transfer credit. They had started a degree program in their country and wanted to finish in the US. And now a very significant part of our business is actually professional licensure. You were trained as a pharmacist in Egypt. You want to go and practice as a pharmacist in the States. So they have to get an evaluation from our organization that says they've completed these basic courses, they're licensed as a pharmacist in their country, or they're missing some significant components of a pharmacy credential. So we do all the foreign educated pharmacists and dentists, some accounting boards, some teaching certificates. And it's also to keep in mind, in the States, every state is autonomous. So if you are licensed as a teacher in Wisconsin, that does not mean that you can drive from my house 100 kilometers south and be a teacher in Illinois, because they have a completely different licensure process. So this holds true for nearly all professions. There's some states that have reciprocity, but in the US, we have a Department of Education, but it has very little power. It doesn't accredit institutions. It doesn't provide guidelines for programs. It has some very broad responsibilities, more so, I would say, at the K through, the primary and secondary sectors, and very little at the post-secondary sector. So this slide is just kind of to say, how does it fit? My husband owns a translation agency, and one of the things that we always think is sort of similar is everybody forgets about us until the last minute, and then they realize they need us. So if someone makes a fancy machine in Wisconsin and they're trying to export it to Germany, at the very last minute, they realize that they need to have all the handbooks and so on, manuals translated into German. Well, with credential evaluation, it's kind of the same. So the learner, whether they're an employee, student, licensee, they make an inquiry to an employer or to an institution. And typically, the institution says, you need to get a credential evaluation. Then they hustle to us and say, I need this evaluation in 5 days. And we say, okay, we can do that. We do the evaluation, and we say what their education is equivalent to, and typically in the US or in Canada, and we do some for New Zealand as well. And what we do in most cases is make a transcript, or it's like a diploma supplement, of the foreign education into the US terms, so the reader can see, oh, they have 3 credits in anatomy, they have 3 credits in psychology, and can make a judgment, and then also grades, convert it into the US A through F grading system. Then the receiver, what we call the third party, so the institution, the employer, the licensure board, makes a decision about this candidate or student based on our evaluation. And then they're either admitted to the university or get a job interview or so on, or they are, can be rejected at that point. So I'm going to try to be mindful of the time, because I have a lot of discussion-y kinds of questions for us at the end. So this is the evaluation process. I won't go through, is the institution secondary, post-secondary? Is it like a community college? Is it a university? All those kinds of things. What is the recognition status, which is often the most difficult question in our list? Is the documentation authentic? What is the program level? Is it a postgraduate? Is it, doctoral level, and so on and so forth? Was the qualification awarded? This can be a little bit tricky when there are countries like, say, for example, in the countries that I evaluate, Iraq is a good example. You have completed the program, but you cannot officially graduate without completing military service. That's not atypical. Or in Mexico, for example, you don't get your titulo until you've completed a mandatory public service of a year or 2. So students come to us and they say, look, I've completed all all the credits I need to get my degree. I have a degree, and we say, no, you don't have a degree, you have a carta de pasante. And you won't get your degree until you complete your civil service. And so we have to make a decision as to whether that program is completed or not. What was the purpose of the qualification? Is it a professional kind of credential to prepare someone to be a teacher or a veterinarian and so on? And then converting credits and grades. I love this slide for audiences like this because we tend to get so excited about digitalization, right? Setting up APIs, blockchain, all these having portals where we can download documents. This is the year 2022 for another month. And we see every single one of these types of documents all the time. And so for us, that means a couple things. That means that we have to have processes within our office to process all these kinds of documents. We have to have people that can scan documents that are familiar with document forensics. This had a raised seal. This has pixelated signatures. This is a document from Syria that has clear plastic tape over the grades. All these this has microtext. So the document specialists make an analysis, they scan the documents, and the documents go to the evaluator to evaluate. Photocopy or scan can work if we are able to verify a document online. We still see a ton of primary originals. That means the document that you were handed when you walked across the stage and got your diploma. We often see a lot of documents in sealed envelopes sent from the issuing institution. Thanks to COVID, we get a lot of emailed documents, so we have done a significant amount of research on email spoofing. And some of my colleagues have given presentations and so on about that because it's a huge problem. Then a verified document. So a document, regardless of what format it came in, we can verify it in one way or another, either contacting the institution directly or online verification. And then finally, documents sent or retrieved electronically. So via API, sent in an email, and then we click on a link and put in a password and retrieve it. Or a lot of times we can retrieve documents from portals where documents are uploaded. But credential evaluators see all of these all the time. Some of the electronic options, either institutions, boards, ministries of education, repositories. For example, DUO in the Netherlands is really a repository for academic credentials. And this last one, the third-party vendors, is a pain for us because that adds another level of questioning trust, right? I never thought in my life I would quote Ronald Reagan, but here we go. Trust but verify. So you want to trust this, but third-party vendors, it's a wild, wild west out there, right? Nobody's regulating them. So you have to go to the institution, say, are you really using, Sam's document company to issue your credentials? If the university says, yes, you can trust Sam's document company, and then we go from there, making sure that their technology is compatible and so on. And some of them charge us a lot of money, some of them charge the students a lot of money. Anyway, delivery portals with accounts, emails with links, emails with attachments, APIs. Formats, we see PDF, CSV, EDI, XML, and blockchain. Mainly, I wanted to mention something that happened to us recently that we learned about. And, we're talking more about the idea of self-sovereignty, that the learner has control of their documents, how they're shared, how they're used. This is something I'm interested, we'll discuss this maybe a little bit later, because I've seen really different reactions to this. So Singapore uses blockchain technology to issue credentials. And we first started getting them. The format in which the document is received is not one that we could use in our system. So you can download, I think it's a .io document, download it, and then you upload it into Singapore's system, and it will verify it for you. So that part we've sort of integrated into our processes. But here's the problem. The student can go in before the document is made available and remove failures. For us, that's shocking and troubling. Other people say, don't care. They got their degree. These are the courses they passed. We don't care if they failed things along the way. So this has sort of created some interesting dilemmas for us, because the institutions that receive our evaluations, we usually provide 2 grade averages. One that includes every attempt at every course, and then one that includes only the final attempt for a repeated course. So if they took a course and they failed it or got a not very good grade and retook it and passed it, we can do a GPA without that. Methods and best practices, digital docs. So TISEP, which is the Association of International Credential Evaluation Professionals, I chaired the task force on digital student data, and we came up with these best practices for digital docs. So confirm that the source is authorized, confirm the method for transmission is secure, and that's where a lot of the email spoofing stuff comes in. Develop documentation requirements appropriate to the country and institution. So we have, if you go to our website, you can see there's a list of every country in the world and what documents and what format the students send in. And sometimes we'll even say, like Ukraine, for example, if it's an older document, we need to see the original. If it's newer and it can be found in the depository, which amazingly is still up and running, then just send us a photocopy and we'll check it on there. So we have to communicate to the student what documents, what format. Some cases it's contact your university. We have an agreement with them. They can give us a digital document directly. So every country and within a country, it's different. This is a little bit of a tangential comment, but there's a university in the UK, UCL, London, University College London, and they recently said we only issue electronic documents. Up until maybe a year or 2 ago, they would send sealed envelope documents. So we got a bunch of sealed envelope documents that looked fantastic. And we contacted UCL, and they said we only, have the student contact us, we only issue documents electronically. And we pressed a little bit, and they said, no, these are all fake documents. So part of our job is to know that UCL only issues documents electronically, even though a few years ago we were expecting sealed envelope documents. So that was kind of an interesting thing. So documentation requirements specific and flexibility in systems and processes to account for differing formats. Some challenges in electronic documents. How do we ensure authenticity? There's no system that can't be hacked, that can't be somehow have a chink in its armor. So we need to find a way to do that. Privacy issues. We get students all the time that say, we said, we need your document from UNAM, National University of Mexico. And they say, oh, here's my login to my student account. Just go in there and you can download my document. And we say, we'd love to, but we can't do that. Legally, we cannot do that because there's access to your bank account and access, I could change your address and all. And students like, please, and we're like, no, we can't do that. Privacy issues, and also we're having to deal with giving students the opportunity to be forgotten. You know, for us, we're not in Europe, but many of our applicants come from Europe, so we need to have make sure we're on top of some of those privacy issues. We need to update and share resources and processes with other credential evaluation agencies or people at universities. Communication with learners is a big issue. Availability and usability of technology, and this was touched on a bit last night for those of you that were there. I have concerns about underrepresented regions who do not have the technological resources that the global north does. We have to find a way to bring them along. So this is Kofi's journey. And I have until Q2, right? Kofi is a good West African name, so we pick Kofi. So Kofi went to high school in Benin, and as it so happens, he gave me his baccalaureate, and it's verifiable online. The Ministry of Education in Benin, you can sort of put in his student number and so on. Poof, he's got the bac. That's all good. Then he went to Ethiopia. Well, Ethiopia are still a sealed envelope country. So we needed to have the university send the documents to us. And they became emailed. Then he did a postgraduate program in New Zealand. New Zealand, the University of Auckland, and most universities in New Zealand and Australia use a third-party provider. So here, this one student paying us for one evaluation had 3 different ways of getting his documents to us. I mean, it'd be great if they were all the New Zealand pattern, but that's just not realistic. And so we have to communicate to Kofi how to get his documents to us, and then we have to have a process within our organization to process all these documents. And then we have to issue an evaluation report, which we issue via a portal to institutions that have signed up for it. So this is the Digital Credential Providers Hub. So this is TISEP, which is the professional organization for credential evaluators. And we created this hub so that credential evaluators can go there and say, I have a document from Brazil. Is there a way for me to get this electronically, to verify it electronically, and so on? Currently only available to TISEP members, but I'm happy to give you a temporary login if you want to take a look. So, all right, is this my water, I think? Trust. Trust and transparency continue to be a challenge because some places, even with electronic, I grew up in Wisconsin, I've opened beers like that for most of my life. So even in countries, like I've seen this particularly in Africa, that are developing some electronic ways of issuing documents, there's still a lack of, could this be hacked? How do I make this secure? Vigilance, just because it's electronic or digital, doesn't mean it's secure. The cooperation piece is so important to me. Like if we can share, best practices and share ideas, that's fantastic. And in the big picture, the documentation is only part of what we do. We're still evaluating credentials. We're still analyzing a credential from one country and saying, what is this equivalent to? Is a 6-year medicine program from India equivalent to an MD program in the US, which is usually 8 years? Or, in the US, law programs, law degrees are postgraduate degrees. Most countries, they're not. So how do we, that's the bigger picture of it. So sharing information internally and externally is so important. Self-organized. Oh, okay. And so we have a few minutes for questions and ideas. So I'm happy to discuss any of these if anybody wants to latch on to any of these. One of the first one is one that's very interesting to me. Who owns the assessment? Anybody want to weigh in on this? So we think the student, the learner, owns their credentials, right? That it's not the university doesn't own it. The university's, the transcript is a representation of what the learner has achieved. So we prepare an assessment based on our judgment. So do we own it, or does the student, that become then part of their backpack, part of their digital wallet, or is it still our assessment because it's our judgment?
Kind of depends on your view of public or private education and what your own part is.
What we do is basically allow the student to do whatever they want with their assessment for 5 years. And then we basically say it's no longer valid. And the reason for this is information. We get more information. We change our judgment. We used to evaluate Iraqi grades one way, and then we changed how we evaluated them. So we basically say for 5 years you can share your assessment with whomever you want, but after that we pull it back. Which is interesting that there are platforms that allow us to do that. Also, it's a dilemma for us is we've gotten a lot of revenue from copies. So we issue the document, we issue the assessment, and the student sends it to a university or licensure board. And then if 6 months later they're applying to 3 more universities, then they're paying us for copies. But when we're issuing our assessments via, into a wallet, it basically, the learner then has, can choose what to do with it, which is, I think, how it should be, the loss of revenue notwithstanding, right? But that's been issued to them. We shouldn't have to say every time you want a copy of that, you have to pay for it. But anyway, so communication is always an issue, communicating with learners and so on. Then what role should the learner play in the final version of the academic record? Anybody think it was okay for Singapore to allow students to remove failures?
I mean, we have this question on digital credentialing because in Germany, universities have to legally issue a certificate at the end of something, and then, but does the learner actually have to accept it? I think that's kind of a similar question. But does anybody want to answer the question on Singapore?
Hey, Meg. I think the Singapore case brings about an issue that has to do with sort of the technology that we use to streamline these processes, which is digital credentialing. And there's an interesting new feature that these emergent technologies or that verifiable credentials allow, which is called selective disclosure. Effectively, this says that, since you own your records, you could decide to share what part you want of it at a granular level. So if you just need to prove that you're, over 21, this is a typical case, you don't have to show your name and address, But in some use cases like this, that may not be what you want or what is desirable. But a lot of the conversation around agency and sovereignty of learners, owning their records and doing whatever they want, end up at this granular level in conversation around selective disclosure as a mean to support self-sovereignty, which is where I think there's a bit of friction and we need to be very much use case specific. Clearly, in this case, that's not desirable. And there is, to some extent, you may want a learner to curate a profile or their presentation, what they share with an employer or an admission officers, but there are informations that you may not want them to play around with. But the technology allows it.
Okay, interesting.
Would you agree, or did you want to answer? You said there was an inhale of breath, and I thought, okay. Would you agree with that, Margaret?
I think so. Yeah, I think we're becoming more flexible than we used to be. But the other comment I wanted to just mention that we struggle with right now is our role vis-a-vis informal credentials. Traditionally, credential evaluation agencies, credential evaluation professionals have no idea what to do with informal credentials. They have no idea how to evaluate them, how to convert them to the US educational system or the Canadian educational system. So, you know, I have some ideas about that, but I think we'll talk about that in our panel in a little bit. So, and then also we've spent a lot of time thinking about what are our responsibilities to refugees and others who have earned credentials but might not have the documentation. So my organization will do free evaluations for refugees, but they still have to have pieces of paper. Other organizations that for example, the Norwegian process that includes interviews and so on is pretty amazing and also very time consuming. And unfortunately, we see an awful lot of refugees, particularly in the States right now, that have almost no formal education and very few informal badges, those kinds of things. So we're struggling with integrating them into our society. But I mean, you know, everybody's been dealing with this. You know, the world has its largest number of refugees ever, I believe, right now. So everybody's dealing with it in one way or another. But any more questions? We're kind of out of time, but I'm happy to have anybody follow up later or as you think of things. Feel free to contact me.
Yeah, and we'll be making the slides available as well. So.